Hello, hello, and we're now live. I can see people coming in very smoothly. Have to apologize for my dress code. It's obscenely hot here in the south of France. It's 36 degrees Celsius. If there are some really big emitters in the audience, please accelerate your transition to net zero so that I can survive.
Yeah, climate change is real, I would say. But you know what? I just got back from Kenya, and people there are freezing. You know that they were telling me it's like 20 Celsius in Nairobi, and it has never been that cold. So apparently, climate change has also this worse phase, right? Where we may be laughing that 20 Celsius is not that bad, but in some areas the impact is really serious. Also in the other direction, not only that it's too hot.
Well, we can keep the friendly chit chat for a couple more minutes, I think, just to let people arrive. Let's give everyone about 3 more minutes. In the meantime, everybody, please feel free to throw in the chat either your location or the temperature in your location if you want to show some record highs or lows.
If we still have any socks, maybe the person living in the highest region wins pair of Orbify socks. 38 degrees, whoa.
Oh, yeah, but we only have 22 in London. What if I want some?
If we have, then, well, maybe you'll win Orbify socks for the least hot summer.
The mildest summer's day. Well, we had a hottest June on record in the UK, but July has become suddenly very bizarrely cold. I'm seeing some good ones in the chat though. We've got 30, I think 38 from Madrid is winning. Does that beat you? Oh, you're actually in the south of France. You said you were at 36.
Yeah, 38, sorry, definitely beats me.
Mexico is competing with Madrid.
I see Ryan from MD. So I used to live in Washington D.C. area, which is obviously right around Maryland and Virginia, and it's obscenely humid. So it's hot and humid, and you walk like I don't know 2 meters, and you're sweating so badly. It's just like do not go outside if you're spending the summer in D.C. Yeah, Ryan is confirming in the chat.
I like the response from Estonia from Ilya. 21 degrees, pretty chill. Everyone go to Estonia.
Yeah,
Lisbon seems to be all right too. 28.
Oh, Yan Ping, I'm British and I can't think in Fahrenheit. Can anyone convert Fahrenheit and
very
Celsius
hot.
in their heads? I need to learn how to
That's
do that.
That's about 30.
Yeah.
That's like 30 something.
100 is 38.
Yeah, okay.
So getting up there.
Oof.
Ghana. Okay. Lambert, I don't know if you joined early enough, but Jakob was just saying that he was in Kenya.
And it was very cold.
What's the weather in
negative
Ghana
32
today?
degrees in Slovakia. That is some climate weirding, let me tell you.
That takes the price, yes.
Just kidding, Elena.
All right, it's right. So it's 4:05. I think it's time to kick it off. I'm sure some more people will keep arriving, but let's keep it going. So hi everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today. I'm Olya, your host and moderator for today, and I have 4 presenters or speakers with me today who are going to speak on either ESG or geospatial. Please be aware that they are not just buzzwords, and this is not a webinar about the buzzwords. We're actually going to discuss some serious topics here today. So in the order of presentation, I have 2 ladies from BCI here today. It's Shayna Gallagher, Net Zero Manager from BCI, as well as Emily Faint, who is Net Zero Policy Manager at BCI as well. BCI, by the way, is a British standards institution who is part of ISO, International Standards Organization. So they are a national body of this international organization. So these are the people who set the standards for everything, including, for example, the net zero policies. I've also got Indre. Hope I'm not going to butcher her last name, but I'm still going to go for it. Kaduskaite. Did I get that right, Indre? Thank you.
But close enough.
Sustainability manager from Deloitte. Probably Deloitte needs no introduction. And I've got our own founder and CEO with us today, Jakob from Orbify.
Hello.
And I think we're pretty much all ready to go. Well, actually, we've done the intros, but we would like to understand who is on the call here today, on the webinar here today in terms of your roles. My colleague Carlos is going to launch a quick poll in the chat. So please respond so we can understand your background. Thank you. And while you guys are responding, I'm going to turn it over to Shayna, who is going to do the presentation from BCI.
Thank you so much, Olia. Bear with me, everyone, while I share my screen.
And while she's doing that, guys, you, as usual, can put your questions into the chat while the presenter is speaking so that you don't forget them. And then we'll take them at the end of each presentation. So first will be the ladies from BCI, then it's Indra, and then it's Jakob. So keep the questions coming. We'll take them after his presentation. And then, as usual, if some of the questions are not answered during or after the presentation, we'll answer them by email. So
thank
Shayna,
you so much. Can everyone see my screen? Because I cannot see you. Excellent. All right. Yep. So yes, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where in the world you're tuning in from. My name is Shayna Gallagher, and I'm the Net Zero Engagement Manager for our 2050 World, which is a collaboration between ISO, the UN Race to Zero campaign, and the UNFCCC Global Innovation Hub that is convened by BSI to enable and mainstream the transition to net zero through standards. Today, I'm here to talk to you about the changing standards and reporting landscape and how ISO's net zero guidelines can support your net zero transition. But before I do, we have some more polls to do, and I want to get us started with two questions that I think will help reflect the overall perception of ESG reporting frameworks and guidance that we're all grappling with right now. So, first of all, who here feels like there is one unified, simple explanation of what ESG means? Yes or no? And I cannot see the poll, but I assume that it is launched in the chat. So please participate.
Can confirm it is launched, and I can see everyone responding.
What is the verdict?
No.
Unsurprisingly.
No,
all right,
very
that is what I expected. And next poll, do you feel like there is one unified, simple explanation of what net zero means? Emily, how's it looking?
Oh, it's a little bit closer,
okay.
But no has the lead. In fact, I can see no almost
so
doubling.
That seems like a problem, given that many of our jobs here as ESG practitioners is to implement a net zero strategy. And obviously we are all in aggressive pursuit of net zero by 2050, but there's not yet alignment and convergence around what that really means. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. There's a lot of justified confusion around the various definitions and reporting frameworks that exist. And the good news is that everyone agrees this alphabet soup of reporting and guidance is confusing and at worst counterproductive, and that there needs to be convergence and consolidation around these frameworks and standards. And we are making progress on that. So here's the context that we'll be going through, the agenda we'll be going through today. And of course, the context for all of you is that many of your jobs is to de-risk your organization's sustainability strategy. And emissions reporting is an important step in that journey, and often the first step, because you can't decarbonize emissions that you don't know exist. In the past 2 weeks, frameworks like the ISSB standard have come out, and the TCFD framework that you can also work within to quantify your emissions. As of today, it was actually announced that next year, TCFD will fold into ISSB, demonstrating that the convergence is happening in this space. And increasingly, this reporting will be mandated by jurisdictions like the EU and the US's SEC. But ultimately, your net zero journey is about a much bigger picture sustainability strategy that goes far beyond just reporting. So today, I'm here to talk to you about the Net Zero Guidelines, a tool developed to support this big picture, keep you on track towards your goals, and facilitate your jobs as ESG managers and practitioners. So once again, our 2050 world is a collaboration between ISO and all 167 of its national standards bodies around the world, the UN-backed Race to Zero campaign, and the UNFCCC Global Innovation Hub that is convened by BSI. And we created the ISO Net Zero Guidelines, which were published last year. So what are these guidelines? They are not, very importantly, another emissions reporting framework, don't worry. Instead, they are a core reference text for credible net zero action to bring clarity to what good net zero action looks like. And they draw on the existing landscape of major net zero standards and initiatives to harmonize best practice in one place. So to be very clear, the ISSB standard that came out very recently is a disclosure framework. Many of you will be familiar with SBTI, the Science-Based Target Initiative. That is a target-setting framework. And the ISO Net Zero Guidelines are a tool that consolidate both aspects of net zero action and many more, enabling you to create a rock-solid, robust, and ambitious sustainability strategy that once again includes both target setting and aligns you with net zero by 2050, and also helps you to stay up to date with the disclosure expectations in your jurisdiction. On the screen is just a snippet from the Net Zero Tracker's Net Zero Stocktake report, a link to which I'll share in the chat after this presentation. And it shows how the ISO Net Zero Guidelines stack up to aligned net zero target setting standards, and how there are increasing levels of convergence around the most important principles of what good net zero transition plans are and how to report them. Importantly, the ISO Net Zero Guidelines are completely compatible with the UN report Integrity Matters. And in fact, the Carbon Trust has found that it's the only major source of net zero guidance that aligns with all 10 of the UN's recommendations on greenwashing. So once again, the Net Zero Guidelines are bigger than just disclosure standards. This guidance is about your entire net zero journey, including how governance is set up, and covers the many elements of de-risking your sustainability strategy that you need to be thinking about. So quickly, why were the ISO Net Zero Guidelines developed? Well, eventually, for the sake of our planet and for the sake of our bottom lines, net zero governance will become mandatory. In the EU, nations already report carbon emissions as part of their nationally determined contributions. And for non-state actors, such as corporations, it's expected that emissions are reported as part of disclosures required due to the non-financial reporting directive, or when participating in schemes such as the EU ETS. Reporting requirements will be strengthened, as in requiring third-party audits, and expand organizations covered via the CSRD as of 2024 in the EU. So in other words, it's strategic for you and your companies to be having forward-thinking, ambitious net zero transition plans that incorporate all leading aspects of best practice. And that is what the ISO Net Zero Guidelines can help you to do. Until then, yes, there are an overwhelming number of reporting frameworks and guidelines, and unless you operate in a jurisdiction where a given framework is mandatory, it's up to you to pick and choose which framework to abide by. But the ISO Net Zero Guidelines can help you make that decision and ensure that you are on the front line of best practice when it comes to net zero action. I won't go too into depth here, but do want to point out that the Net Zero Guidelines were mapped across 33 globally prominent and highly used net zero standards and initiatives to bring together and drive global best practice in one place. So in other words, the guidelines are meant to be a one-stop shop for you and your target setting, reporting, and holistic net zero transition strategy setting. Now, standards like the ISSB standard fall particularly within the measure and reporting sections of this journey, but don't cover everything. And given the salience of the ISSB standards that were released earlier this month, I'm also going to share a link in the chat after this presentation on the 10 things you need to know about the standards and what they mean for you and your company. ISSB will ultimately help to provide the world with consistent, transparent reporting on emissions and climate-related risks. But as I've said, there's much more to a net zero journey that your organization will need to take into account. So what else is there to consider, and what do the net zero guidelines actually say about these topics? We've pulled out several of the top lines from the guidelines in the following slides, including making a public commitment of getting to net zero by 2050, incorporating that commitment into core governance documents, aligning your lobbying with that commitment, and aligning executive and board compensation with meeting your targets. The takeaways from the net zero guidelines on this slide are particularly relevant for this presentation in terms of emissions and revolve around emissions reporting recommendations. So specifically, the net zero guidelines dictate that all greenhouse gases should be accounted for in your transition plan, and that all scope 3 emissions should be accounted for in interim and long-term targets. Finally, the net zero guidelines include the most up-to-date best practice guidance on topics such as residual emissions, fair share, nature and biodiversity, net zero claims, avoided emissions, and all aspects of your sustainability reporting. So the question now is, of course, how do I begin using the ISO net zero guidelines? The answer is they can be found easily at iso.org/netzero, along with case studies about how corporations like Netflix are using ISO's net zero guidelines to design and implement their sustainability strategy. And here's just a little bit more guidance about how to get started and how to keep going. The guidelines can be used at any step in your net zero strategy, even if you already have a net zero strategy, and are meant to support ongoing action, keeping your ESG policies in line with best practices and emerging regulation. And as a final note, before we move into Q&A, since we have such a global audience with us today, I'd like to point out how ubiquitous climate and sustainability related risk and disclosure are. Already, nearly half of global GDP is covered by mandatory disclosure requirements, and that percentage will only grow in the years to come. As climate-related regulation becomes more robust and both customers and clients expect more from you and your ESG strategies are expected to become more ambitious, we hope and believe that the ISO Net Zero Guidelines will be an invaluable guiding tool that you can use to create, evaluate, and evolve your net zero transition strategies. So with that, I will close my presentation and very happily take questions and put those links that I was mentioning throughout my presentation in the chat. Let me end my slideshow.
There is already a question in the chat that was put in there while you were speaking. It's from Lakshmi.
Yes, Lakshmi. Let me find. Okay. Question for anyone who can assist. How to enable financial institutions understand what makes certain standards and certification schemes credible to help them ensure that their due diligence and verification processes assure robust sustainability practices? That is such an excellent question. Emily, would you like to take that one?
Yes, very happy to. Thank you very much, Lakshmi, for that question. I think this is something that Shana and I get a lot in our role. Briefly, I think a key concept that I think this audience should be aware of is the role of what we call the global quality infrastructure. That is the infrastructure that the international standard system like ISO and national standards bodies like us in BSI perform in national economies, which is this conglomeration of standards bodies, accreditation bodies, and third-party assurance. So one of the real values of ISO standards, distinct from others that you may be aware of, is the fact that an ISO standard is something that is directly linked to accreditation bodies who train auditors to go out and assess whether an organization like yourselves is performing against the standard as you're claiming that you are. So you can look at where a standard is developed, how it's developed, the governance process it follows, and whether there is certification available against it to help you understand which ones may be credible. And I imagine that one of the reasons for this question, of course, is because certain standards in the climate action ecosystem are reviewing their governance to make their verification processes more robust. And this is, again, another example of that convergence and alignment that Shana referred to earlier, where more and more of these standard setting bodies are beginning to scale their assurance system to make sure that it's clear to you in your capacity why their standard is credible and why it can help you on your.
Yep. I think we lost Emily. So in the hopes that
Did I disappear?
Yes, but you're back.
I apologize. Where did I get to before I dropped?
I think we basically heard everything you were saying, if you just want to pick up.
Oh, great. Yeah, I hope that came through clearly. Like, Shima, sorry if that was broken up there. But essentially, that's how you can tell whether something is credible if there is an existing accreditation body and third-party assurance schemes against it.
Perfect. Shane and Emily, there are 2 more questions in the chat. One from Benjamin, another one from Dora.
Yes, hopefully my connection won't drop this
Mine
time.
too.
One from Benjamin.
One?
Can you say anything about the potential convergence of disclosures around, is that not only emissions, but also biodiversity and ecosystem protection? So the full shebang. Absolutely. So Benjamin, I mean, again, you've hit the nail on the head. When we talk about convergence of climate standards, we do mean the whole ecosystem. And actually, one of the things that, as Shana pointed out earlier, that the ISO Net Zero Guidelines does comment on is the integration of biodiversity and the role of nature in your mitigation strategy. So effectively, if you have a net zero strategy that is not considering its impact on biodiversity and the role that nature plays, the guidance says now that it's not a good net zero strategy and we all need to go back to the drawing board. The success of COP15 at the end of last year and the 30x30 agreement you raised, I think, is a fantastic success for the prominence that the role of biodiversity and nature has to play in climate action. And more, these different frameworks and standard setting bodies are speaking to each other and beginning to consider, as their standards get revised, how can they integrate and join up their frameworks. So Shana mentioned a great example of TCFD and the ISSB standards. We're seeing it also with the ICVCM, the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets, and the VCMI. And absolutely, I think the same thing is happening with biodiversity and ecosystem protection. So stay tuned on that, but it's a great question to raise and something that is just as important as purely considering emissions reductions from an accounting perspective.
Next question. If an organization is already ISO certified, how much information are they already receiving around these net zero standards?
Great question, Dora. So this is the complexity of the standards landscape that Shana pointed out. So when you say ISO certified, it depends on which standard you're talking about. So an example may be that you are certified against the ISO environmental management system standards, or you might be certified against the ISO greenhouse gas quantification standard. As Shana raised earlier, these are really critical parts of a net zero journey, but not the full picture. And what's happening with the standard system is that more and more attention is coming around to how can we make it easier for organizations to understand the full journey they need to be on, rather than leaving it to you to try and connect these different standards yourselves. So if you read a copy of the ISO Net Zero Guidelines, which you can find at iso.org/net zero, you'll see in the guidelines themselves, they actually refer to some of the ISO standards I've just mentioned. But I think if you do already have a ISO standards in use in your organization, you do reach out to your ISO national standards body and ask them for more information about the ISO Net Zero Guidelines, and they'll be able to help you.
All right, let's take one more question from Matthew. What are the biggest challenges for companies to gain assurance on compliance with standards? How messy is the audit and the assurance process examining standards compliance, quote unquote?
Emily, did you get that? Do you want me to take it?
Great question.
We may both be breaking up. Can you hear me, Olia? Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
I can hear you. I think Emily.
If she let me get started and then she may return to us. So you're right, Matthew, that this is a big challenge. And, unfortunately, most companies don't actually have the resources or the bandwidth to do this auditing themselves. And that is a big part of the beauty of the standards process. Ultimately, when the net zero guidelines become a full-fledged standard, which right now we fully acknowledge they are not, to Dora's second question, they are guidelines. They were developed through a workshop process, but will ultimately very likely become a standard. And when that time comes, ISO has partner accreditation organizations that do this auditing and third-party verification in partnership and alignment with organizations like BSI in the UK and ISO globally. So the quick answer, Matthew, I would say is I wouldn't worry about it for now, to be honest. I would focus on designing and implementing your own net zero strategy. And as long as you personally feel that it is aligned with the net zero guidelines, then it is very likely robust and ambitious. The reality is this is a rapidly emerging dynamic landscape. And of course, things are changing. By the time that there is a more legitimate auditing process in place, we will have a lot more clarity around what is the actual mandatory regulation in your jurisdiction. But personally, I would not recommend you as an ESG practitioner feeling the need to audit a net zero strategy if you don't yet already have a net zero strategy that is robust and aligned with the net zero guidelines in place. That would be the first step. Hopefully that answers your question.
Seems like it does. All right, let's take the last one about the NBS projects and the application of ICO certifications to those. So we're talking about nature-based solutions, either reforestation or conservation or afforestation, on top of standards introduced by registries such as VERA and Golden Standards.
Yes, great one. Emily, are you there?
My connection should be stable now.
I think she's trying to be.
Yes, hopefully everyone
I
can
think
hear
you're
me
muted, Emily.
So I can take this one. It is certainly possible
Can you hear me now?
to apply ISO certifications really at any point as long as there is a relevant standard, right? And ISO, BSI, and other national standards bodies are relatively rapidly creating relevant standards to respond to this moment of climate change, nature-based solutions, and all of the emerging questions and processes that are having to develop very rapidly. So I would say that you should hopefully feel like there is an ISO standard that applies to any sustainability-related question that you're grappling with. If you don't feel like there is one, I would reach out to your national standards body, and you, of course, can find that information online, or to ISO directly. And if you don't feel like that standard exists, then that's likely something that is being developed in real time. But definitely, either these standards do exist, they can certainly be layered on top of other standard certifications. And if a specific one that you think should exist doesn't yet, then that is something that you can work directly with your national standards body to create.
All right. Thank you. Thank you both. Everyone, ladies are going to stay with us until the end of the presentation. So if you've got more questions, you can still put them in the chat. And I believe Shana has also put in her email address. Shana, please double check if you did not, if your email is spelled correctly. I think there is a small typo. Please double check it. With that said, let's go to the second part of our webinar today, the part that's presented by Indra. She's going to cover the best practices when it comes to ESG reporting. Indra, the floor is all yours.
Hi. Okay, let me share my screen. Okay. Do you see it properly?
Yep, perfect.
Yeah, great, because I have two screens, so I'm just making sure. Okay, so today I'll speak about reporting frameworks and disclosures. By the way, it's really nice to see such a diverse crowd here from many different countries. I saw in the chat also that there is a colleague of mine from Hong Kong, if I'm not mistaken, so someone who I never met before, but here we are together on this call. So it's a pleasure. And so I'll speak about the E part, so environmental reporting, the trends there, let's say, the mistakes that companies make and the challenges, and hopefully you can learn a thing or two. So overall, voluntary sustainability reporting has been growing significantly. I'm from Lithuania, so we are in the European Union, and European Union has some quite strict regulations, and there is a number of companies that already had to report about sustainability in their companies. However, we see that even like the companies that don't have to, they still do that because of, I don't know, conscious trends, stakeholders, etc. So this is a map that shows voluntary GRI sustainability reporting and the growth, and we can see that it's really drastic and significant. Of course, it could be that some companies, that are in this graph reported in the past before, but simply they adopted the GRI methodology. But that's the tendency that we see, and that I'm myself happy about it, and that businesses are taking on the responsibility of their actions. And also what companies, not necessarily organizations maybe, tend to do is that they choose more than one reporting framework. So there was a study done by Accounting Association, and these are the findings which I found interested. So they analyzed more than 600 companies from all over the world. They took the biggest companies in each countries and regions that they analyzed. So therefore, there's like a high percentage of the companies that are reporting on ESG. So it's 95%. Of course, it's because it's the biggest, but the trend is that the smaller companies are also reporting on this topic. Sustainable Development Goals framework seems to be the most common one, and 79% of the companies follow this framework. However, I would say that it's a little bit loose, maybe. It's not, let's say, that strict or that clear. So when we work with companies, we advise to use maybe other frameworks, such as GRI, for example, which 74% of the companies use. And then there are a few others, such as CASB, TCFD, and a few more. And we already saw a few logos during the first presentation. So there are numerous frameworks that you can choose, actually, for your company to report on environment. But I would like to speak about a few, and GRI actually is, I would say, the most common that companies, at least in European Union, use. They may use others as well, but usually GRI is the first step. So let's have a look what should be reported on environment as per GRI methodology. So first, there are more topics. So there's also biodiversity, and other topics, but these, I would say, are the most common, and that all companies, have some impact on or are impacted by these areas. So the first one is energy. So the companies should know their consumption, which may sound like a no-brainer, but actually it's not. A lot of companies, especially those that are renting their premises, so they don't own it, but they rent it and they pay for energy consumption to the landlords, they don't know their actual consumption. So consumption, also the split of renewables and non-renewables. Then very good indicator is energy intensity. So in your report, you should not only say how many kilowatt or megawatt hours you consumed, but also what is the intensity, right? So you can use such indicators as floor space or number of employees or revenue, and then or like units of product produced, because that shows how effective you are, right? Especially if we will be comparing, or you will be comparing the energy consumption, throughout time. So like how much energy you needed to produce one item, and how much do you need now? Let's say if there is 5 years difference. The second topic also, the most common, probably I would say the biggest buzzword among all these, is emissions. So how much greenhouse gas emissions you are emitting. Again, similarly to energy, emission intensity and reduction of emissions. From waste, and for all topics actually, you should describe in the report, let's say when you're talking about the environment, is what impact you are doing, why, like how, what of your operations, let's say, cause this impact, how you're managing it. Is it a positive or is it a negative? So same as with energy emissions, waste. So let's say, okay, waste, or do you generate considerably large amounts because you're maybe producing something, and or use a lot of packaging, for example, or it's actually not very material, you are just like a software company and it's just a common waste. What activities you do to prevent waste generation, and amounts and treatment of waste. So this is also not such an easy topic, because companies don't know usually what is the treatment. So they just pay for waste collection company and they deal with everything. And the water is very similar. So management of water and the amounts of total water withdrawal, discharge, and consumption. Usually it's withdrawal and discharge is the same for the companies. So my main message here is that sustainability, or let's say part, environmental part in sustainability reporting, is not only about climate change or emissions. It's good, and it's probably one of the most important topics right now, because as we spoke at the beginning of this meeting, we can feel that the climate is rising, right? So that's the hot topic. But if you want to have a comprehensive, good quality report, like sustainability report of your company, you must address other topics as well. So that's about GRI. And another one that I wanted to speak, so it's about carbon, not only, but so more like climate focused. So it's called Carbon Disclosure Project, or CDP. And they claim to be the richest and most comprehensive data set for like corporate and city action in relation to climate, and for companies to basically report on their environmental impacts. And they have 3 areas. I don't know if you can see very clearly, but I will describe it for you. But this is the growth of companies that are using this methodology to report on their actions. And there are overall 4 columns. So the red one, the highest one, is number of companies that are disclosing based on this methodology. And of course, the growth, similar trend to as we saw with the GRI. And they have, like, let's say 3 areas that companies can choose. So it's climate change, water security, or forests. So climate change is it's almost the same as the total, like the number of companies choosing to disclose on climate change is the same as overall number for companies disclosing under this methodology. Water is this, let's say, in the second place, and unfortunately forests are in the third place. So if there is like around 8,400 companies using this methodology, only 500 are disclosing information on the forests. But that has been like growing. So overall, I believe with the upcoming also regulations on the forest in European Union, and since it affects companies that are importing to European Union, I believe that these numbers will change a bit. And the information that the CDP is requiring to disclose is about like for climate change. Overall, the structure is quite similar for all three groups, but it's about the management process, risks and opportunities that you create and you see for your organization, your greenhouse gas emissions, and the risks, opportunities, energy consumption and efficiency. For water security, similarly, you have to describe uh, what what is the management, how we manage water, what are the risks, opportunities, is there any risks for water pollution in your business? How do you manage water, and about the plastics as well. So since that's a big problem as well, right? Plastics in our oceans. And for the forest, similarly, so do you cause any impacts in regards to deforestation, forest degradation? Is there any are there any changes in land use in your operations or in the supply chain because of your business operation? Forest management as well. So we have to describe, information about the forests that are under your ownership or control. This is, of course, just a summary. It's like quite extensive questionnaire for each of these topics. So it's just a summary, and for you to get a grasp about this framework. So now about the most common mistakes when reporting on environmental impacts. It's I would say it's similar to other areas S and G as well, but it's more, I would say, more relevant for environment. So inaccurate or incomplete data. So data has to be collected from many different people, departments. As I mentioned, if you are renting the space that you're in, it means that to prepare your report and measure your impact, you have to collect information from even different organizations. So that may lead to unintentional errors, which has to be addressed, double checked, and you have to make sure that that's the correct data. Then the lack of context and benchmarking, that is especially relevant if you are reporting for the first year. That should be interesting for you to know as well. So if you gather data about your energy intensity and okay, so you have the number, let's say per employee or per square meter. So is that a lot, or is that actually very, very little? So it's good to have a look at the industry average and maybe compare yourself in the annual report, or if you are doing the report for many years, so provide the data for the previous years. The other mistake is lack of clarity and transparency. So I often, not often, okay, sometimes see companies that don't want to disclose all information. So the way that GRI and actually quite a few other methodologies and frameworks work, that you kind of pick and choose the topics that you want to disclose. So they tend to pick topics that are that they perform well at, and then maybe leave out the information that they don't want to discuss. So that's not very ethical in general. Yeah, or for example, if there has been increase in the energy that you consume, and you provide an explanation that maybe only partially explains the increase. The next one is insufficient goal setting. So if you only report but don't have any goals, so yeah, I mean, it's a report, but it's not very, I would say, not a good one, because then you're just reporting the number increases or decreases, but for, let's say, a reader, your stakeholders, it does not help to understand, okay, so how good are you actually doing? And ignoring materiality. So I mentioned a little bit before that in the report, you should address the topics that are material to you, where you are doing the impact, either good or bad, or are really important for your stakeholders. And my time is almost up, but very quickly, the challenges that I see um, um, that organizations face when they are reporting on the environment in their sustainability report, it is very connected to the previous one, because where the mistakes happen because of the challenges that companies face, right? So data availability and quality, that's the biggest one, definitely, even in organizations that are very big, that have SAP systems and etc. And it seems that they are, really gathering data and analyzing it and etc. But then, yeah, maybe, but not throughout the whole organization. So maybe they know, I know energy, but they don't know anything about the waste that they are generating. So that's a really big issue. And if you consider to issue a report for your organization, then that should be the first thing. Just check which data you have available and improve the process. Scope 3 emissions is also quite challenging. So Scope 1 and Scope 2, I would say, are relatively easy to calculate for the companies themselves. There are even calculators online. You can Google it. There are a few, but the Scope 3 is quite challenging. There are 15 different categories. There is greenhouse gas protocol, which very well explains, the methodology and etc. But it's still quite complicated, and you have to have and find a lot of information yourself, not even about your own organization, but let's say the emission factors that you should use. In the companies, especially in the bigger ones, it's not clear who is responsible for the reporting. It's actually, the ownership should be divided between many different departments. So maybe you are sustainability manager, but your colleagues should actually support you, but they think that it's you who needs this report. So they are like, maybe not very helpful. And EU regulations. So EU regulations are really complex, lengthy documents that affect not only EU companies, but also the companies that have business with EU companies. And it's quite tough to go through all of that by yourself. So here it is. That's it from me. Thank you very much. And maybe you have any questions.
Indra, we've got one question in the chat already. How often do we find stakeholders not aligned with areas where the organization might be doing
well? Okay, so if I understood correctly, it happens, I would say, almost for every company. Maybe if I understood the question correctly, that when the company is doing the materiality analysis, they provide their stakeholders with a list of questions. Let's say, which topics are material for you, what we should address, etc. And then the stakeholders, especially if it is a B2C company, so let's say the consumers or the general crowd, societies, I would say, so the bigger stakeholder groups, they choose the topics that are overall important for them, but maybe the company does not do much in that case. So for example, if it's a B2B company, but then stakeholders rate data protection as very important high topic that the company should definitely address, but then the company actually does not gather any or very little data, because they are more like B2B, or they serve customers but they don't gather that data. So it does happen that stakeholders view from their own kind of perspective, but from the business perspective it does not make much sense. Or stakeholders rate the topic that is not very relevant for them, but actually the business is doing very well in certain area and can even increase the positive impact, or is actually that's where they generate negative impact. So but there is let's say even by GRI and also CSRD, the upcoming EU regulation, the let's say advise how the company should determine the material topics. So it wouldn't be only based on what stakeholders expect, but also the impact that the business makes. I hope I answered it.
The next question is about parameters that could be included in the ESG reporting that concern forest. I guess the use of forest or the preservation of forest or the impact on forest.
Yeah, so I think it would be best to look at the CDP, probably the one that I showed, and that asked, so okay, you as a business, do you generate any risk for forest? If you own the forest, how do you manage it? How do you prevent the risks? What is your strategy actually on managing the forest in the long term? How do you intend to mitigate the negative impact, etc.? So you can check the questionnaire. It's the big questionnaire for forest, and get the idea.
I think another interesting question is from Benjamin. Why do some of the big four choose to build out their own climate intelligence capabilities in-house, like PwC, versus others who partner, for example, Deloitte and Jupiter? Excuse me.
I don't know. Very difficult to comment, but I think that overall this environmental area it's developing now, like at the moment, and I mentioned, for example, a few calculators for scope emissions, right? So it's some are like everyone is doing it kind of at the same time. Like you don't know what others are doing, and then you just both go live at the same time. And then one is like €1,000 for scope 1 and 2 emissions, or like €500, and then another one is just free of charge because I don't know, maybe it was supported, or it's actually was not that difficult for them, and they aim to sell more other types of services. So so yeah, there's a lot of unknown in this industry, and everyone is just doing it at the same time, and then we look around and we see, okay, other companies chose different paths.
Got it. Let's take one more. I know there will be a couple of questions left. We'll try to address them after the last part of the presentation. So a question about material topics. Do they change depending on the sector, like different for IT and mining?
Yes, of course. Even when like GRI and other reporting frameworks, they even have like reporting guidelines based on the sector. So they are developing sectoral guidelines, what information should be disclosed. So that's for sure. But overall, I would say the principles remain the same, that you should look at what stakeholders expect from you, and what impact you make, either good or bad, and what's the current status. So so the logic is the same. Maybe the sectoral standards are developed so the companies would not be able to maybe avoid reporting on some of these topics, or maybe they're like more comprehensive.
Got it. Well, let's switch to the last part of our presentation, where Jakob is going to cover how maybe geospatial data can help strengthen the part of the ESG reporting and maybe even help combat the greenwashing. Jakob, the floor is yours.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Olia. And maybe let me take it from where Indra finished and start from data availability. Right. This is a problem that we all are struggling if we are trying to have meaningful reporting, not just greenwashing, as you nicely described this, Olia. So I hope that now you can see my screen. Does it work? Yes, no, maybe? Okay.
Yep, it
Cool.
works.
So
it
we know
works.
something without running a poll. Thank you very much for confirming. Looks like actually to the question that Shana asked about whether there is some common understanding of what ESG and net zero mean. I think looking at the list of variables related to environmental reporting and how closely it matches what we've been already discussing, I think that's luckily there is some overlap between what we understand when we talk about ESG, environmental, net zero topics. And among those variables, there are some that are easy to measure, right? Like energy consumption, water consumption. Usually you can just take a look at a meter device and, oh, this is how much water, this is how much energy we used. But then there is this topic of operational footprint, like air quality and the amount of greenhouse gases that is being emitted to the atmosphere, pollution that is being created, water quality, soil degradation, biodiversity impact, and environmental compliance. Those things that are not that easy to measure with just a simple metering device. And I guess this is where the true power of Earth observation, remote sensing comes into play, because it enables us to look at a certain area where my enterprise is operating, and measure the impact, measure the changes. So, for example, if we are looking at greenhouse gases emissions, we can measure a lot using Earth observation, remote sensing. Just to start with publicly available data, right? So not to force you to purchase commercial data. You can consider data coming from Sentinel-5 mission operated by European Space Agency that enables you to plot both spatial distribution of air quality. Here we are looking at air quality and the concentration of aerosols in the proximity of Marseille, right? So we can observe the higher concentration, lower concentration, how it looks in this whole area. We can also observe how this is fluctuating over the year. In this case, we are looking at SO2 concentration. The important thing is that we can not only think about emissions, but let's imagine that instead of a urban area, we've got a forest here, and we would be seeing absorption of SO2, NO2 by the forest. And if there is urban area creating NO2, SO2, we'll be seeing that once the air passes the forest, it's actually becoming clear, right? So these are the parameters that when it comes to air quality, we can easily measure by Earth observation, remote sensing. Similarly, water quality, something that will be important for all of us operating in coastal areas. If you are a port facility, if you are a factory located close to some bigger waterbeds. You will want to measure pollution, oil spills, sewage that is being released to the water, but also some positive impact, chlorophyll, biodiversity, biomass that is alive in the in a lake or sea that you are located close to. And here again, by using also public level data, Sentinel-1, Sentinel-2, we can measure a lot of those relevant parameters. I don't want to make this webinar into a product webinar, right? So I'm not going to take you to our platform to show how easy it is to click, but please believe me that these parameters can be very easily monitored with also Orbify, but probably some other platforms enable this as well. When it comes to biodiversity, right, here we can think about species data. So what species are living in a certain area, or how many different species are living in a given area. We've got metrics coming from Shannon, coming from Simpson, and their teams that enable us to estimate what sort of ecosystem is alive, and we can monitor over time. Actually, we can monitor over time how the ecosystem data are changing, maybe encouraging biodiversity heterogeneity, maybe encouraging animals to live in an area, maybe encouraging new types of plants to grow, or maybe acting totally against this, right? So here we are again thinking more about optical or radar data collected by various types of satellites. Environmental compliance. So here, I think we touched base also a little bit about degradation of the environment. And if you are into business that is based on nature, maybe this is olive oil, palm oil, paper, gum, right? You will want to observe the impact on deforestation of things that you are doing, and with remote sensing, you can easily generate reports like those that enable us to understand, okay, this area here by the river, it got deforested around 10, 12 years ago. And over here in the middle of the forest, there was something that happened, most likely not anthropogenic, right? Because anthropogenic requires actually some transportation channels, and I think this can be attributed to human activities. But this thing here, maybe there was a disease that happened around 5 years in this area, right? So these are the things that we can quite easily observe, monitor using Orbify, and you can report, you can get the data that Indra was alluding to, that will feed your reports, that will make your report something trustworthy, something that actually provides real accurate information. And I hope that with this sort of monitoring, we can actually stop this level of deforestation that can be observed in this map. Here we are looking at almost a big province in Para state, close to one of forest reserve, this forest, right? We are looking at actually the whole province around it, and you can see how much it has changed over the last 20 years. In 2000, this area was covered pretty much entirely with rainforests, and now 20 years later, you are seeing how big of a difference there is. Almost half of forested areas has been destroyed, cut. And I think that's, well, if we want to have a planet where we can live, we need to do a really good job to actually prevent the other half of this forest to be destroyed. So this is what makes me very, very much impressed by the efforts that Indra was talking to, but also BSI Shana, thank you very much for the work that you are doing to ensure that we keep our planet in a not as bad condition. And I think this brings us to an end. If you have any questions how you can get that sort of reports, well, of course, I'm all happy to dive deeper, but for the sake of time, I guess, Olya, back to you.
We already have one question in the chat about, let me find it. Is it possible to monitor the sediment of riverbed?
Yes, it is. Well, in general, it's possible, right? The question is what exactly you want to see, what type of sediment, but in general, this is possible with remote sensing, with proper data. Depending on the type of sediment, you may need commercial data. You may not, Sentinel-1, Sentinel-2 may not be sufficient, but in general, this is doable with Earth observation remote sensing.
Another question is it possible to export
your data? Yes, of course. Well, from Orbify, right? You can download the data as maps, just as I did for the sake of this presentation. You can export it in form of GeoTIFF that can be imported to tools like ArcGIS, QGIS. You can also via API integrate your business workflow with Orbify and get results directly to fit your management system.
The key value proposition of Orbify is data and aligned to ISO Net Zero. May we check if you are part of the TNFD data catalyst?
So, Lakshmi, if you are talking about the data are coming from multiple vendors. There is NASA, there is European Space Agency, there is a couple of commercial vendors, right? So the data are captured with various ways, and we try to actually use different sources of data to ensure the value of our calculations. And when you are talking about our calculations, right, because this also has impact on the end value, then yes, we are using certified methodologies. We are trying to follow standards that have been described in papers, so that what we are presenting is not only true, accurate, but is also credible and reliable.
How effective are the satellite sensors in getting accurate localized data?
So if you're talking about geospatial, if you're talking about spatial resolution, then depending on the type of the satellite, we are talking from 30 meters like Landsat through 10 meter like Sentinel-1, Sentinel-2, down to, I don't know, sub-meter resolution coming from vendors like Maxar. And when it comes to accuracy of geospatial coordinates, then this is correlated with the spatial resolution. So if we are talking about sub-meter resolution of data, then obviously geolocation of the pixels will also be sub-meter.
And what about monitoring emissions? How can we gather that data for the report?
So if we're talking about emissions, then I guess we can jump a couple of slides back here. This data that I'm presenting here are coming from Sentinel-5. They are not very accurate. This the spatial resolution here will be closer to 100 meters. So for some of the factories, this will not be sufficient. And for that sake, we are working also with commercial vendors. I don't want to, again, turn it into a very commercial webinar, but if you're interested in details, let's chat. We are working with some commercial vendors that are providing couple meter spatial resolution data that one of our customers is, for example, using to track down unwanted methane emissions from their installations. So this is something that is not only someone has done it, but actually at Orbify we are doing that sort of projects. I hope this answers this question. It was a long answer to a simple question, but I hope it works.
All right, I think that was the last question. I think there's going to be one more poll, basically about if everyone who is attending today sees themselves using some of the geospatial data in their ESG reporting. But other than that, I would like to thank our presenters for their insights today, for taking all of the challenging questions from the audience. I would like to thank all of the attendees for having those questions in the first place, for engaging in the polls and basically supporting us throughout the webinar. If you guys have any more questions after this webinar, you can always email us. You can email me personally at or@orbify.com. I'll then direct your questions to the speakers. Thank you, Carlos. He just shared in the chat. You can find everybody's LinkedIn account, so you can also connect with the speakers. The recording of this webinar will be sent around in 2 days. So if you know of someone who have missed it, you can always share it with them as well. It's going to go to everybody who has registered for the webinar. And we'll keep you updated on the next upcoming webinar shortly as well. Thank you again, everyone, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much, and have a great afternoon.